All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody African. This day, November 9th, 1974, a woman by the name of Dr. Connie Redbird Uri gives an impassioned speech at a board meeting in Oklahoma City of the Indian Health Services. In this speech, she proclaims, quote, "We have a new enemy, and the enemy is the knife." What she's referring to is the fact that Dr. Uri had just visited an IHS facility in which she claimed that up to a quarter of Native American women who had passed through that facility had been forcibly sterilized. They'd come in for one procedure or to give birth, and then, without their consent, been given hysterectomies or other procedures that left them sterile. And this moment began a years-long campaign to expose and investigate the practice of forced sterilization among Native American communities, not just at the facility that Dr. Uri had visited, but throughout much of Oklahoma and other Native American territory. Some of the numbers here are just startling, and some, I will say, are a little contested, but it is clear that this was a widespread practice, and as Dr. Uri stated, this idea that up to a quarter of Native American women of childbearing age in these regions had been sterilized is just kind of stunning. And over the coming years, there would be protests, congressional hearings. There's a march on Washington that featured tens and tens of thousands. So let's talk about these forced sterilizations among Native American communities targeting Native American women. I do want to thank our listener, Matthew, who suggested this topic. But here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Nikki, this is a very disturbing story. I want to get into some of the specifics, but I think, I'm not exactly sure the way to phrase this, but, the reasons for these procedures. There's this mix at these IHS government facilities, health clinics. When a woman comes in, there's this mix of eugenics, paternalism, anti-poverty efforts. Like, what is the larger context of why these procedures are taking place, and often without consent?
So I think the word that I would pull out there is eugenics. There is this belief that these women are having too many children and that they're too poor to take care of them and that they aren't exerting proper control over their reproductive choices, which is interesting in a country where until 1961, the pill wasn't legal, bans on contraception weren't declared unconstitutional until 1965, abortion wasn't made legal until 1973. Like, there are all of these ways in which women had been denied control over their reproductive health. But here are these doctors who are saying, no, we're going to make that choice for you because we know better than you whether or not you should continue to have children. And this was true in these communities. This had been practiced in against Latinas in California for a long time. So this was a kind of widespread practice in U.S. medicine to sterilize women without their consent, particularly the poor and minority women.
In the 60s, just to add some context, in the 60s and 70s, 13 states proposed sterilization laws with the idea that it would reduce the number of poor and illegitimate children. So, to be clear, this is not like doctors at a facility have gone rogue and are doing this weird, messed up eugenics experimentation. This is like part of a policy.
This is something that civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer talks about a lot. She calls it a Mississippi appendectomy, the idea that they were doing this on poor Black women as well. And the common thread among all of these hysterectomies among women of color and poor or impoverished groups is the lack of consent. Most of these women think that they're getting, treatment, or they're there to deliver a baby, or they're getting a checkup, and they have no idea the procedure that is taking place on them will not allow them to have children anymore. And it didn't always matter if you had already had children or if you hadn't had children at all. If the doctor deemed you unworthy of motherhood, he could take that away without your permission and sometimes without your knowledge.
And these were ideas and laws, by the way, that were prevalent in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, sort of the age of eugenics. The Supreme Court had signed off on them in a ruling called Buck v. Bell coming out of Virginia. And it was believed to be at the time the best use of science to breed a better people and to move the United States into the modern era. And of course, this is all discredited in the 1940s because of the Holocaust and the practices of the Nazis. And yet it continues into the 1960s, into the 1970s, into the 80s. It's not called eugenics, but it is the same set of ideas behind it that are motivating it.
And a fundamental dehumanization, right, is at the heart of all of this. And this question of consent is really interesting, too, because there's a lot of, as I hinted at, there's a lot of sort of contested and murky information about the scope of this. But I think that proves, more than anything, kind of how this was happening behind closed doors, how tricky the notion of consent can be. I mean, some people were going in for some procedures and the procedures went wrong, and there were medical reasons to proceed with certain things, but then how do you give consent in that context? And then there were certainly instances where people were just completely denied agency and were given these procedures. But my mind often goes to kind of like, how do you get your head around the data here? How do you get your head around the numbers here? And it is just so murky. Again, that to me that reinforces just this larger idea of negligence, that it's not even worth keeping track of what's going on inside of these facilities.
To just add one other layer of that murkiness, for Latina women who this happened to, often they were given consent forms in English, even when the doctors knew that they didn't speak English. So there is a nod to consent, but there's no actual real consent being given. But I think that it matters that we're talking about Indigenous communities here, because in this case, and one of the ways that Uri talks about this is in a broader history of genocide within Native communities. And this is seen as a kind of medicalized version of that to keep Indigenous women from having more children. And I think it's important that while this practice is happening in a lot of different places to a lot of different communities, that in Indigenous communities, it has another layer of resonance.
Oh, yeah. And I also think it's interesting because Dr. Uri, when she finds out about all of this, she basically quits medicine, goes into law school. It's the first Native American woman to get both a medical degree and a legal degree, and then uses her legal degree to really pursue these cases of women who have faced all kinds of reproductive injustice. And so, the numbers to me are just quite staggering. I mean, in some cases, you have 3,406 instances across 4 of the 12 IHA areas over 4 years. It's between 1973 and 1976. And a majority of these sterilizations are done without consent, as we mentioned before. Dr. Uri calls it a sterilization factory. So that its purpose is just to rob women of their reproductive rights.
I mean, think about those numbers. Over the course of 4 years, that's nearly 1 sterilization a day that's being performed illegally. So sterilization factories is not an inaccurate way of talking about it.
And the effect of this, I mean, certainly the trauma on women and on a community, but also, I mean, Dr. Uri predicted in 1977, she said that basically this is going to lead to the wiping out of all, she called it, quote, pure blood women of the Kaw tribe in Oklahoma, because a vast number have been sterilized. I know that's one of the places where the numbers are a little contested, and, you know, Native American populations have fluctuated up and down. But, you know, certainly there's generational trauma and generational impact here. Okay, I suppose we should talk a little bit about some of the changes that get enacted. I mean, so we have this picture of this doctor who becomes an activist. And over the course of the following year, so, you know, this moment that we're marking here in 1974 is when she really starts to sound the alarm. It takes a number of years to build momentum and to really have this become a salient issue. In 1978, there's a 3,000-mile activist trek from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., and this is where 30,000 people gather for a rally on the Mall and give speeches. And then there are congressional hearings in 1978, at which point some stricter measures are implemented.
Right. So the what was then known as the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare puts in place new guidelines. They mandate that consent forms have to be given to women to explain other ways that they can use birth control, that you're not going to have your federal benefits taken away for refusing to be sterilized. That was a coercive measure that was used to get women to consent to these procedures. And it included an interpreter's signature. So to make sure that women were being told this in their native language. And it also, I think, importantly pointed out that a woman can't consent if she is in the middle of labor or if she is under the influence of medication. Like, she has to be in
or
a
she's
state,
knocked out.
Right, where she can actually give full consent. And the fact that all of this needs to be laid out so clearly by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare suggests that all of these practices were taking place. And, you know, some of them would still continue to take place. But at least there were these measures put in place and rules outlined for how to avoid this.
But I think two of the things that remain to this day that I think is interesting is just the belief that poor women don't deserve to have children, that somehow either poverty is genetic and you will pass this on to your children, as though society has no way of curbing poverty other than sterilization. And the other sort of myth or idea about this is that we push reproductive rights a lot today, but I don't think, and Dorothy Roberts talks about this a lot in her book, that we don't also think of a woman's right to have children and to have as many children as she wants to have. It's also part of the equation. It's not just about birth control or abortion rights. It's also, if I want 10 kids, I'm going to have 10 kids. And I think these are two concepts that are really hard to deal with because we only think of having children in terms of finances. I have X amount of dollars, I will have X amount of children. And so these ideas are still something that, you know, we have to confront.
Yeah. I do want to highlight this notion of, you know, poverty and the sort of moral value that gets assigned to poverty. There's some pretty striking language in the 1978 hearings where in implementing some of these stricter regulations that NIki talked about, there's also language that says, quote, poverty is not a crime of individuals against society. I just found that so striking. Poverty is not a crime of individuals against society and does not call for such punishments as sterilization abuse of poor individuals by an affluent society. And, you know, that feels like such a clarion call tucked into this thing from 1978. And it's, you know, clearly a lesson that I don't think we've learned. I mean, even now we hear this language of poverty as a moral failing creeping back in, and poverty as being a punishment for something that someone has done wrong, and thus makes them undeserving of help. That language is still out there, I would say, across the political spectrum in many ways.
And just to underscore that, I mean, the 1995 Welfare Reform Act,
Right.
Which guts aid to family with dependent children, is full of that language, right? The people are trying to scam the government, and that the government shouldn't be helping out the poor in society. And this language from the late 1970s is a really powerful rejoinder to that.
Yeah. So in recent decades, there have been ongoing conversations. I mean, I would say largely these stories I feel like are lost to history. But in recent decades, there have been some attempts to provide reparations and compensation to women, and some women have not gotten it. So what is the state of play as we see it when it comes to reparations?
So a few states, interestingly, southern states, have taken or started the process of what would be known as like reproductive reparations. So in 2013, North Carolina agrees to compensate 7,600 women for the sterilizations that it performed in the 1970s. In 2015, Virginia agrees to compensate over 7,000 women that it also had sterilized. But in contrast, and here's the real rub, more than 41,000 Native American women were sterilized at these IHS facilities, and no one has received any compensation.
Yeah, I feel like those are striking statistics because these smaller numbers have had some sort of compensation and not Indigenous women. And I think that that's something that resonates with reparations that we've talked about before, that there have been reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned in facilities during the war, but there haven't been reparations for something like the institution of slavery. And often when there are bigger numbers, there's just kind of this blanching at both admitting fault and also coughing up the funds.
Yeah. At the same time, though, my goodness, what cost do you put on your womb? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you would even... I'm not saying there should not be reparations. I'm just saying how they go about calculating how much each woman is owed, I think, is also telling.
Yeah. We should say as we wrap up that certainly this conversation about and this legacy of coerced sterilization continues. I mean, in just the last year, there were these allegations of for-profit ICE detention centers conducting forced sterilization procedures on immigrant women. And again, I will highlight that was a story where the information was swirling and it was so murky, and so much of this is happening without transparency that it's hard to understand and hard to get a sense of really what is going on. But it just, it certainly evoked a lot of this really shameful legacy, and it continues today. All right. Well, that is where we will end the episode. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.